Hello everyone and welcome to our event Affordable Housing, Airbnb and the Ditigal Services Act. We have brought together an interesting group of mayors, local politicians, activists, experts and NGOs to discuss how we can regulate online short-term rental and ensure affordable housing. My name is Kim van Sparrentak and I am the rapporteur for the report on access to decent and affordable housing for all in the European Parliament. We see that all over Europe, housing prices are soaring and that we have an affordability crisis. In the preparation of the writing of the report, I talked to a lot of experts, NGOs and cities and became more and more aware of the vast scale of the problem. Over 80 million people in the EU are overburdened by housing costs. In the last decade, the number of homeless people in Europe has risen by 70%, and any night, 700,000 people are sleeping rough in Europe. When looking into what is causing the rising cost of housing, I came across three reinforcing trends: gentrification, touristification, and financialization of housing. At the intersection of the three trends, we find short-term letting. Airbnb is no longer the airbed or the occasional renting out of a spare room. It has given rise to a new business model where it is often more interesting to rent housing to tourists than to residents. And this is driving the real estate investment in this direction. Amsterdam, Barcelona, Bordeaux, Prague, cities across the EU face similar problems. Housing is extracted from the market and rented on a large scale on online platforms. And this also impacts the livability of the cities. Today, we'll be hearing the testimonies from several cities from Europe. Because we see that cities have been fighting back short-term letting to provide housing for their citizens. But unfortunately, the regulations put in place are often challenged in court by the short-term rental platforms. But even if there are local rules in place, cities simply don't have the relevant information, such as the number of nights rented, to enforce their local rules. The possibilities for local authorities to oblige the online platforms to cooperate are limited under the current e-commerce rules. Of course, we have to make sure our digital single market keeps functioning. But the current problems go far beyond the online realm. This is about protecting the fundamental right to housing. Large online platforms with such an important impact in the real world should not be able to hide behind EU internet laws. They should at least have a responsibility to cooperate in enforcement of rules against the excessive effects of the services they facilitate. The Ditigal Services Act presents an opportunity to rethink these dynamics. We have organized this event today to discuss the effects of short-term rentals on affordable housing and how to ensure local authorities can regulate and enforce it. We are looking forward to hearing our experts' opinion on these issues, and I hope we have a fruitful discussion. Now I would like to give the word to Dorrit de Jong, who is my colleague from the Dutch Greens and is a city council member in Amsterdam responsible for housing. Hello, Dorrit. Welcome to our event.
Hi, Kim. Hi. Thank you, and thank you very much for having me today. As a representative of the Greens in Amsterdam, the shortage of affordable housing in our city is one of my greatest worries at the moment. The past few years, we have seen a huge increase in tourist numbers. It's the point you already said. The pre-COVID prediction was that visitor numbers would rise up to 32 million visitors a year in 2030. And for a city with not even 1 million citizens, that's a lot to take. So the past few years, we saw a huge increase in short-term holiday rental, especially facilitated by websites like Airbnb and Booking. We saw over 30,000 apartments listed on Airbnb. And this had a huge effect on the quality of life in certain areas of Amsterdam, especially in the city center, where many apartments were rented out the whole year. People would not recognize their own neighborhood anymore. They would run into strangers on their hallway. There were a lot of concerns about that. And furthermore, these houses were not available for people who want to live in Amsterdam anymore. Prices increased, we saw. Therefore, our local government decided to restrict short-term holiday rental for a few years ago. We have limited the number of guests up to 4 people per booking, and the number of nights you could rent out your apartment was limited to 60 days a year. That wasn't enough. And we also saw an increase in the number of bed and breakfasts in our city in that period of time. So we have decided to limit the number of nights even further to 30 nights a year. And since this summer, everyone who wants to rent out their apartment for vacation rental need to have a permit. And they need to register every night they have visitors. So that's how we hope that these rules will, of course, they will help us limit the number of visitors and limit the Airbnb in our city. But of course, due to COVID-19, we're not sure what these effects are yet. Well, one of the most difficult things in this discussion is the enforcement of these rules. We can set rules, limit the number of nights, limit the number of visitors, but how do we enforce them? If every homeowner would only rent out their apartments when they're gone for a weekend, it wouldn't be such a problem. The problem is that there are so many houses that are rented out the whole year, places where no one lives anymore, and where it's basically an illegal hotel. But how do we enforce that? That's so difficult. There is no accountability on websites like Airbnb. You can have one owner with multiple listings. There's no formal registration per address how many nights there have been visitors. And the national government has made a next step. They have made a new law about registration, but still it is sort of voluntarily for these websites. And we, as a city, we say that Airbnb, they facilitate illegal holiday rental, because on their website, you can still rent an apartment. The same apartment is still rented out more than 30 days a year, basically. And you can also just go to Amsterdam and say, well, I'm going there with 6 guests, and you can be in one apartment. And obviously, that's not the situation we would like to have in our neighborhoods. That's why we had to take the next step last year. We even prohibited short-term holiday rental altogether in 3 neighborhoods in the city center. There we saw that the quality of life was really decreasing because of the number of tourists. And we said, well, there's no short-term holiday rental possible in these areas. And we're now looking to extending that prohibition to other areas. But of course, there's another side to it. And it would be really easy to say, like, we are going to prohibit it altogether. But we also have homeowners in our country or in our city who, due to COVID or other reason, have seen a decrease in income. And for them, of course, it helps them a lot to sometimes rent out their apartment or their house just to pay the mortgage. So it's quite a big step to say that it's not allowed at all anymore, and therefore we are looking to regulate. In order to regulate, we either need the cooperation of the platforms or we need more legislation. We have tried to cooperate with Airbnb in booking. As a city, we have had a lot of discussions with them, but they refuse to implement the 30-day rules. So unfortunately, that's not working, and that's why we think legislation on a European level is necessary to get the data from the platforms, to know in which houses how many nights people are staying, and also to be able to hold the platforms accountable for facilitating the tourism as they do. And that's why we cooperate in the network of European cities. So as a city government, to conclude, I think it is our responsibility to set the rules and make sure we do what is needed for our citizens to live happily and well in our city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorrit, for telling the story of Amsterdam today and all the hard work you're doing there. I will now give the word to my colleague Ernest Urtasun, who's also a member of the European Parliament from Catalonia. And he will host the first panel of today. So, Ernest, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you so much, Dorrit, as well, for your introductory words. I'm so glad that we're having that session with so many friends and activists from civil society on a pressing issue where we need the European responses. And I think where the report that Kim van Sparrentak is working on now in the Parliament will help a lot defining those policies. So thank you so much for your attendance. In this panel, the first one, we will discuss the impact of short-term letting, okay, on affordable housing in cities. We have some great speakers, as you have seen in the program, who know the heavy social impact of the lack of control of short-term rentals in touristic cities, where some neighborhoods have changed dramatically, as we were hearing now, crowding out the citizens and the traditional small businesses. We are seeing that in many, many different cities in Europe. We also have the local authorities in that panel who have been in the front line of the fight against these threats. And let me underline the special role of the cities that have been pushing for bold initiatives and that too often have had to deal not only with these powerful global companies and the lobbies, but also with the lack of understanding and commitment of the national and European authorities. In Spain and Catalonia, we know very well that phenomenon of the cities fighting almost all alone against the phenomena. So I'm not taking more time from you. I'm going immediately into the panel where we had, as I said, great speakers. I would like to give a warm welcome to all the panel members of the first panel. And as the first speaker, we have the Green Mayor of Bordeaux, Pierre. Congratulations, by the way, for your election. We are very happy for that, and it's really an honor to have you here. And we would like to know more from him about the initiatives that your city council has done to identify and report illegal touristic apartments advertised in platforms like Airbnb and things like that, and other kind of initiatives that you're developing to fight that phenomenon. So, Pierre, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes each for your introductory remarks. Thank you.
On voudrait savoir un petit peu plus sur les initiatives qui ont été prises par le conseil municipal et sur la publication des annonces. Pierre, merci d'être là. C'est à vous. Vous avez 5 minutes par personne. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernest. And hello, and thank you to those who organized and those who participate. I agree with Dorit. The matter is currently at the stake. I will explain what we do in Bordeaux. But now that we have done it, we need the European Union to give us the means to enforce our regulation through the Ditigal Services Act. What is situation and difficulty? In the 10 past years, Bordeaux has attracted a lot of new inhabitants. It has also become more and more touristic. As the previous mayor wanted, a magnetic Bordeaux. A lot of work was done to make the city more attractive and more competitive. It has many consequences, and one in particular on the housing market. The prices of housing have increased in the city, particularly in the historic center. As a response for the touristic demand, 8,000 offers appeared in a platform such as Airbnb. It is likely that these offers contribute to the effect on prices. However, it is very hard to assess and measure clearly the impact on the prices. We see the consequences in the livability. Some shops cannot afford to stay or are not suitable to the touristic demand and disappear. Families cannot afford to rent or buy apartments due to the cost. Inhabitants complain about the habits and needs of tourists. Noises at night, bad management of common trash, cans, parties, etc. In 2018, the city created the new regulation on the change of use, while the principles are housing is of general interest and regulation can be necessary to maintain the balance between economic development and housing. In Bordeaux, we have to choose the use of using and declare it. Every housing has to be used as a home. It is forbidden to use secondary housing uniquely as a short-time holiday letting. Otherwise, we have to compensate it by transforming a place into a housing. It is of course possible for someone to rent their apartment up to 120 nights per year. In order to do so, they have to register. It is implemented this way. At first, a communication was organized toward owners who were previously registered. They had to know about the 120 nights limit and the choice between the housing use and the rental hostel use of their place. We work with a specialist agency which study announcements, multi-owners, commentaries online, etc. And we build up a team to lead an investigation work on the suspicion annonces. It can be relatively slow. They have to prove the infraction counting the comments online, proving that the owner rented the place more than 120 nights in the year. Then we have to go to court. This is where as city we need to support it. This kind of regulation can only apply if they are compatible to the European legislation. This means that some items are to be taken into account in the Digital Services Act because what is illegal offline has to be illegal online. Digital platforms have to respect the law and guidelines of their respective economic sector. In the hostel business, annonces have to include a registration number. It has to be the same online. Public actors have a very good knowledge of what their territory needs. Let them to do it. Give us the means to do what we have to do so that our city stay livable. When we cities have to regulate, we need the data to do it right. Platforms should have to work with public actors on data exchange. What are the results of the regulation in Bordeaux? First of all, the number of annonces stopped increasing. This is a big effect, induced by the lack of rentability of renting housing officially classified as housing for only 120 nights a year. Better, the number
Please,
of
Pierre, if you can start concluding, thank you.
From 8 to 7, the number of from 8,000 to 7,000, 8,000 comment? 8,000. Ouais, 8,000 to 7,000. The number of registration has been multiplied by nearly 3, from 951 to 2,865. 5 between 2018 and 2020. This allows our service to know the market and makes the controls easier. 1,052 apartments or houses went back on the market. We are now waiting for 89 cases at court. Those cases were the late most obvious ones. In addition of a few words on the COVID impact. The COVID crisis obviously has a strong impact on tourism. It probably has an impact on short-time letting, but so far there is no change on the number of announces. However, our team need a request for change of use. Some owners who choose hostel use want to go back to a classic housing use. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pierre. And sorry for interrupting you at the end.
But
that was very comprehensive, and in very short time have explained a lot of what you are doing as a new administration. So thank you so much for this. And now we are going to move immediately to my dear friend Janet Sanz, Deputy Mayor of Ecology, Urbanism and Mobility in Barcelona. Big issue, this issue of Airbnb in Barcelona and short-term letting. She has been in the forefront fighting against the phenomena for some years now. So it's really my pleasure to introduce her. Janet, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. I have a presentation, short presentation. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this meeting between cities and for inviting Barcelona to take part. As cities, we have common challenges and concerns related to tourism and the right to housing. These include the regulation and control of platforms such as Airbnb and the serious effects their activity have in our cities. Because we need to say this clearly. Airbnb is not a simple technological intermediary. Airbnb is a powerful property agent. In Barcelona, we are about government against those that want to take advantage of our city, of those with mobster-like behavior with tourist flats and accommodation. That is why we go after repeat offenders, organized groups, running illegal flats, and advertising them on platforms to take advantage of the legal vacuum on rooms for rent and the lack of the clear European stance. We are mainly up against organized groups, mobsters, who speculate with housing, highly professional fraudsters. Our goal is very clear: to stand up for local people's right to rest and to guarantee the right to housing. Can you pass the next slide, please? Which is the situation in Barcelona before the COVID, obviously. 30 million visitors per year in all modalities of accommodation. Next slide, please. And how impact in neighborhoods, in our neighborhoods, in center of the city. In central neighborhoods, the transitory population outweighs the resident population. Next slide, please. And all this pressure from tourists affects local people. Rental prices have been rising annually by between 7 and 10% in Barcelona over the last few years. The housing rental market in our city is very limited, with just 30% of homes for rent. Next slide, please. And what we have done, we have taken back public control of what goes on in the city. We have started to govern tourism. We approved new planning regulations to guarantee the right to housing and enable local people to carry on living in their neighborhoods. We prohibited the growth in new tourist flats all around the city, establishing that no new tourist accommodation, including tourist flats, can replace existing housing. This prevents local people being driven from their current homes. Our policy is zero tolerance towards illegal flats, and this policy has brought good results. We have recently managed to get Airbnb to withdraw most illegal tourist flats. We've come a long way, but the challenges continue and mean we can drop our word. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we can do everything possible to preserve quality of life in our cities, but we need European and national regulation which allow for better public governance of the global tourist market to guarantee the right to housing. Cities need a European legal framework that protects their capacity to act on the housing market and demands cooperation from holiday rental platforms. The right to housing must top Europe's list of priorities and must be taken into account when strengthening the collaborative economy. Here in Barcelona, we know that governing tourism and its influence on the housing market is a global challenge. A challenge shared by many cities, large and small, from north to south. We have to form a common front within us to guarantee the right to housing and prevent gentrification. We need to share strategies because we will only solve the issue together. Thank you, Ernest.
Thank you so much, Janet, for your comprehensive presentation and for keeping inside the time that we gave to you. So thank you so much. Just before we continue, just to tell you that if you haven't done so yet, you can put your questions to any of the panelists to the panel to the chat box or comment section, and then at the end we will pick some for the question and answer session. So thank you, Janet. And one of the other cases that we have in Europe of mass tourism has been Venice, and we really have the pleasure today to have with us Alice Corona from Ocio Venezia. I don't know if I pronounced that well in Italian, who is a data activist from Venice and who will explain more about her research about the case of Venice. Alice, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for the introduction. I will share my screen. Please let me know if it doesn't work. 1 minute. One second. Here it is. Can you see my slides?
We can see them, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm here to talk about the work I've done with Ocio, which is a Venice grassroots watchdog, and in collaboration with Inside Airbnb, to find the impact of short-term letting in Venice. So what is Ocio? So Ocio is a grassroots watchdog focused on housing issues in Venice. And we work on 3 main themes. So public housing, social housing, and short-term rentals, which is what I will talk about in this presentation. And on these 3 themes, we look at data to inspire our analysis, but also we monitor the policy proposal of the administration or the proposal of other politicians, and we try to develop our own proposals. And a characteristic of our work is that we try to really engage with the public and communicate what we do with the Venetians. And to this end, we organize neighborhood walks where we engage with inhabitants with hyper-local data and stories and issues, so that we make these big numbers and big issues really tangible. And what you see in the slide is an example of one of our walks where we were in a very small alley in Castello in Venice, which is a neighborhood where there's the Biennale, but this alley was very small, very private, and we asked people to guess how many Airbnb beds were available in these few houses and how many residents were living in these houses. And then we had them line up. So on one line, the number of Airbnb beds, and on the other line, the number of residents, to really show how in such a private, hidden street, they were actually almost running a hotel, basically, with inside the houses. So there were 50 beds available for tourists and only 17 residents living in this very small alley in Venice. But other than these very hyper-local stories we got to find, we also are interested in the bigger picture. And so currently in Venice, there are almost 7,000 short-term rentals registered with the municipality for a total of 28,000 beds in these short-term rentals. And these numbers are very abstract, and we can really understand their impact if we look at more contextualize them, both in time and in geography. So if we focus on the water city of Venice, which is the one with St. Mark's Square, or the islands like Murano and Burano, we see that we are now in a point where the number of beds available for tourists matches the number of the people living in those places. So we have about 59,000 residents and 59 beds for tourists, most of which are in structures that are not hotels, but they are basically bed and breakfast, or most of them short-term rentals and Airbnbs. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, so the chart before referenced this old area, which is in red, and the issue is particularly critical in the ancient city of Venice, which is this part here. And this part hosts 80% of all the short-term rental bed capacity of the whole city. And the whole city is this black outline, so it's a very big area. This part here hosts only 80%, all the 80% of the beds are here, despite the fact that it hosts only 20% of the population, which is what is shown in this graph here. So the ancient city concentrates most of the Airbnb offer. And this leads us to the false myths of Airbnbs and the short-term rentals, which we try to debunk with our work. So the first thing we hear when we think about Airbnb and what is being discussed is that it fights overcrowding and it reduces mass tourism because it really spreads out the offers, which we've seen is not true. And we even mapped down block by block for the whole Venice how many short-term rentals are in each block, and we can see really that they concentrate in the typical areas of in the center of Venice. And the second myth of Airbnb is that it's a people-to-people platform and helps you, make an extra income. It is democratizing capitalism, whatever that means. But our studies have revealed the fact that it's very unequal in the concentration of resources. So we saw, for example, that the top 5% of the hosts is managing 30% of the available listings, and it's making about a third of all the income generated on the platform. And we mapped down the network of all the hosts to see how many listings each one of them had. And we saw that about 2/3 of the listings available on the platform are owned by a host who owns more than one entire apartment. And we also did some more qualitative investigation into specific hosts, which I don't have time to talk about now. But so we really are looking into this issue of multi-hosting. And finally, what is the impact of all of this? So I'm running out of the 5 minutes that I had to talk about it. So I will just leave you with this slide as a food for thought, which is showing how strong is the economic incentive to have an Airbnb in your house and to run it commercially rather than renting it to residents, because you can make up to almost 15,000 extra a year per single house that you rent with a hotel like Airbnb management. And so this was a quick overview of the situation in Venice, and I hope we can discuss it further maybe in the question because time was limited. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice, for that impressive data and impressive study, I have to say, on the case of Venice. So thank you. This is much appreciated. And now we will move to Clotilde Clark-Foulquier from FEANSA. FEANSA is an extremely active organization in those matters, and we are really, really glad that we are doing this event with them. And she will present the new report that they wrote together with Fondation Abbé Pierre on the sharing economy and the housing market. So Clotilde, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, so my name is Clotilde. I work for FEANSA, which is the only European NGO focusing exclusively on the fight against homelessness. We are a network of more than 140 organizations, so NGOs, but also cities, foundations, researchers, and others working across Europe to end homelessness. So FEANSA is co-organizing this event today with the Greens, but also with the Fondation Abbé Pierre and Housing Europe in the framework of a partnership called the Housing Solutions Platform. We established this partnership to deepen our understanding of housing solution to homelessness and housing exclusion. So this has led us to work on the impact of the sharing economy on the housing market. And we already started in 2019 and organized an event showcasing the work of the US academic team of Baron, Kung, and Proserpio on the impact of Airbnb on housing prices and hosting a discussion with Airbnb itself and their representative, the European Holiday Home Association. But today, FIANSA and the Fondation Abbé Pierre are releasing a joint report that you can find on FIANSA website and the Housing Solutions platform website. It's entitled "The City is Ours: How to Regulate Airbnb in the Face of a Housing Crisis." Well, you will find that this report has a firmer tone than the neutral discussion we had with Airbnb 2 years ago. And the reason is that we continued to work on this topic and found more and more evidence of Airbnb decisive impact on the housing market. So you can find more about this on our report, but I'll tell you a bit about what's in this report. So of course, it's not just about Airbnb, nor is it just about the concept, but it's about the way this platform have been operating so far and how they have been left to operate. So what we have found, and that you can read in the report, is that before the coronavirus, the expansion of the model had grown very sharply, benefiting, of course, from the growth of the tourism industry and the low-cost airlines. And interestingly, in 2019, according to Eurostat, it was 21% of European citizens who had used a website or an app to organize accommodation at another person's property. So, of course, the issue is not the growth of the model itself, but it's a characteristic of this development. And I would like to stop with you on two specific characteristics. So the first one, which has been mentioned, is the professionalization of hosts and the increased scarcity of long-term rental properties. So as Alice just said, the reality of the model development is really far away from the initial idea of an almost informal exchange between an individual property owner and a tourist. The reality is that a significant proportion of listings are for entire properties and not just for one room. Several studies have shown that a large proportion of listings are from private companies. So amongst others, you will find a report reference to the article of Gil and Sequeira, who show the example of a transnational company offering 211 Airbnb properties in Madrid alone on Airbnb. So it is clear that there is a growing gap between the original idea of collaborative economy platform and what they have become. But what is really dramatic for our organization, FIANSA, Housing Europe, and the Fondation Abbé Pierre, is a dramatic resulting transformation of available housing into short-term rentals that has led to reduction in the number of long-term affordable rental units available. So this is my second point, and it's gentrification and increasing prices. So again, several academic studies we refer to in our report have shown how Airbnb and others have brought about a new form of urban displacement, tourism gentrification, in Athens, Barcelona, Lisbon, or Milan, for instance. Those studies also note that the rise of Airbnb has contributed to low-income renters being displaced outside the city centers, as housing has become less and less affordable to essential workers. So for many, the collaborative economy model is now part of the financialization of housing, facilitating the use of housing as a financial asset and encouraging landlords to rent their property in the short term to maximize their assets. So we believe in the light of this reality, it is really necessary to establish regulation taking into account what this platform has become in order to counter their harmful consequences. So to finish with, I just want to tell you that our report also touches upon the impact of the COVID on the sharing economy industry. Interestingly, alongside travel restriction, provoking a 97% decrease in international arrivals in April 2020, another trend has emerged, and it's a recent return of property to the traditional long-term rental markets. So in Greece, but also in England, in France, in Ireland, for instance, the number of property for long-term rent in some city centers has really increased. It was up by 64% in Dublin and by 45% in London in March 2020. So it really shows that there is a stock that was unavailable because it was on the short-term market. So we believe it might be an opportunity to claim back our cities, as the municipality of Lisbon, for instance, is trying to do with its Renda Segura program, offering property owners up to 3 months rent in advance if they transfer their property back to the long-term rental. But these kind of buyback programs are testament to the difficulties municipalities face in containing the problem and should not be the solution. We believe the solution is for the European Union to adapt its legal framework to the scope of impact reached by this platform and to really give the local authorities the resources to apply current regulation. For instance, by including in the digital services package an obligation on collaborative economy platform to share precise data, or by clearly allowing local and national level to limit Airbnb and other platforms' operation through, for instance, limitation in the number of nights or compulsory registration. So that's it. You can find much more about recommendation and our analysis on our report available, as I said, on the Fianza website or the Housing Solutions platform. And also, please do feel free to get in touch with me if you need. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you so much, Clotilde, for your introductions, and thanks to Fianza for being very active with that and for helping us as well shaping EU legislation in different fronts. And I have been a witness in that in many different files. So thank you for that. Final speaker, we have a legal expert who I'm sure will be able to wrap up a bit from a legal perspective. It's Virginie Toussaint from l'Union Sociale pour l'Habitat. And I will give you, like the rest of the speakers, 5 minutes, and then we'll open the question and answer. Thank you, Virginie, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernest. I'm really happy to be with you this end of afternoon. I'm working for Union Sociale pour l'Habitat, who is member of Housing Europe, the European Federation of Social Housing Providers. My national federation, French, is representing more than 4 million social housing dwellings and housing more than 10 million people in France. And my members are regulated operator, public, non-for-profit, or cooperatives. Maybe you may be asked to yourself, but why social housing providers are interested in this topic? Because, as you may know, in France, use short-term letting on a rent of social housing is forbidden. As long as you are social housing beneficiaries, you are not able to put your dwelling on this kind of platform to offer for short-term letting. It's prohibited by law, and it's a reason to end the contract, in fact, of your dwellings. But even with this, we see in the big cities some of social housing apartments on those platforms, but not only Airbnb, also in France, Le Bon Coin, for example, who are available for short-term letting. So facing this phenomenon, but also not only this, only the second legs of the problem, as already a lot of speakers mentioned before, the relationship with this offer with the shortage of affordable housing in cities, we decided to conduct an internal legal study to understand what is the legal context and what are the possibilities existing to regulate much more this kind of activities. As I mentioned before, our main concern is really about the lack of affordable housing in cities, because the rented market and the housing market in general need to be balanced. There's a place for private renter, but also for social housing renter and also for home ownerships. And it's a very challenging balance to find in order to offer to everyone a place to live. When you have this kind of new phenomenon as Airbnb, you are creating a lot of tension on the private renting market, which is not available anymore for long-term offer, which means for us, social housing provider, putting pressure on demand list. To give you an example, in the Paris region, Île-de-France, per year, we have more than 700,000 demand of social housing and only the capacity to answer to 10% to it. If you are putting out of the private rented market stock all the apartments from Airbnb, it's creating much more tension on our waiting list for the affordable housing what we are able to produce. So that's why we are concerned about this, and also because we are a close partner of local authorities to provide affordable housing in cities, and we can see as then the complexity and the difficulties to implement the rules putting in place, trying to control this kind of phenomenon, because the key problem is also the control. We heard in Bordeaux the difficulty to control this kind of offers on platform. It's also a difficulty for us to control if the dwellings of our staff are on this platform, because we don't have the capacity to follow it and to control it, in fact. So, in the context of this legal study, we elaborate internally. We of course pointed different issues that I'm sure you will develop in the second panel, because it's the main aim of it. But I can already share with you two principles of action that we identify. The first one is, of course, after the following, after the latest case in France, Kelly apartment, that you can control, in fact, the owner of the apartment through the services directive, creating some limitation in the internal market to provide this kind of services for the owner. So it's the first way. Or you can control or try to regulate the platform, which is much more difficult, as we heard before, because you have to have an access to data, even if there's some agreement at European level with the Commission to have some data. It's not binding, and also you have aggregated data. So it's not really useful for local authorities to control. And also it's about concerning the second part, controlling the platform through the Digital Act. It's also the difficulties to create some obligation for them in order to face their responsibility. For example, when there are an illegal content, some offers that should not be on the platform because it's much more days per year for according the local authorization, or it's an illegal content. For example, if it's social housing on the offer, there's a lot of difficulties to oblige the platform to withdraw this kind of offer. So it's really two big difficulties in the two-day text of Digital Act that should be reformed and revised. It's really the way to give access to data to local authorities, but also to create a responsibility of the platform on the content of what we are offering, and notify it to local authorities also when they know this offer should not be on the platform. I was shorter, but I am open for any discussion after, and like that we have more times, I think.
Thank you so much, Virginie, for that and for respecting the time. Well, you are all very strict with the timing, so I would like to thank you for that. Nevertheless, as usual, we're a bit late, so we have decided with our colleagues to move the question and answer until the end. So we will do a question and answer session until the end, in the end of the seminar. So we already, just for you to know, we're already collecting your questions. We have some questions for the speakers in the first panel. So thank you so much to all of you. I think that was a lot. There's a lot of food for thought there on possible reactions from cities, knowing what Bordeaux, Barcelona have done. And also, I think that the studies that have been presented by the rest of the participants also show a number of phenomena and of data that will be extremely useful for our discussion later. So I would like to thank you so much for your input this afternoon. And now I will immediately give the floor to my colleague Marcel, who is a Green member from the Pirate Party in the European Parliament, who will be chairing the second session. And then, as promised, we'll go to question and answer at the very end. Marcel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. First panel, as well as to our audience. We'll come on the second panel, regulating short-term letting online under the Ditigal Services Act. Given that we are running short, in order to give enough time to our panelists, we'll also have some restrictions on time. I will give the floor right away to Zdeněk Hřib, our first speaker, the mayor of Prague, member of the Pirate Party in the Czech Republic. Zdeněk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcel. Dear colleagues, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this event, because the short-term holiday rentals is a key issue that causes a lot of problems in our city regarding the availability of accommodation for young people, and also regarding the decreased comfort of living for the older people. And I have to say that, well, the role and competencies of the city of Prague are very limited also on the local level. I know that other cities do have more competencies. However, in case of our country, we didn't have actually no tools. We didn't have any tools to regulate this problem in our city. In April this year, however, a new law has been passed through the Czech Parliament, and it's a sort of first step for the regulation of the short-term holiday rentals on the local level, on the national level in Czech Republic. And this means that upon request, the accommodation platforms must share information about the contracts, about the capacities, addresses of the listed housing units. So this is sort of a first step. However, we had found that there is a problem regarding the compliance of the platforms with this law. So I believe this is something that has to be solved on the EU level. That means that this thing should be definitely included in some new legislation on the European level. So the cities or the municipalities will have the possibility to ask and request this data from the platforms. In fact, we have joined in January the coalition of 22 European cities who are working at the EU level to amend the Ditigal Services Act and the e-commerce directive in order to balance the role of the short-term holiday rentals. And I also had the privilege to participate in the online meeting on this topic with the EU Commission Vice President Margaret Vestager in September. So basically, what we need as the cities from the EU legislation, at a bare minimum, we need the possibility to ask or request the data from the platforms about the capacities, about the addresses, about the contracts that has been concluded. And that's the first thing. So we do not know, in fact, where these housing units are in our city, because the platforms do not share the data with us now. And the second thing, what we need is that we need a mechanism for the that we can request or notify the platforms about the fact that certain listing is illegal according to the municipal or national regulation, and that we can request an immediate action from the platform, meaning hiding such listing, such illegal listing. And the illegality of the listing could be because of the fact that it's, for example, a social housing apartment, and therefore it cannot be used as the for the short-term holiday rentals, or it could be because certain other legal requirements are not met. This could be, of course, also supported by the fact that the short-term renting platform should require a sort of license number or the some other registration number that would be helpful for us to pair the housing listings or the rental listings to our official registers that we had in the city or on the nationwide level. And this is a bare minimum that we need as a city to deal with the problem of this short-term holiday rentals platform. Because, of course, no one wants to kill the shared economy. I think it's a very good idea if you have a spare room in your apartment that you would like to rent it to some travelers, you want to cook them the breakfast, you want to tell them something about our nice city. But that is definitely something that, for example, Airbnb and similar platforms were at the beginning, but right now this is no more like this. And we have to put it back again into the level of the shared economy, because right now there are apartments in our city that were actually never used for proper housing. They were built and bought simply for the purpose of the short-term holiday rentals, and this causes the problems with the availability of the housing for the young people, and also decreases the comfort for the older inhabitants of our city. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Zdeněk. I apologize that I was not able to properly introduce the first panel in the beginning, because I wanted to give Zdeněk his 5 minutes that we promised. Unfortunately, he needs to leave our panel early, so that's why I rushed into it. So now please let me introduce more thoroughly the second panel that focuses on the possibilities of regulating platforms that offer short-term holiday rentals online under the upcoming Digital Services Act that will be presented by the Commission on the 9th of December. So we're touching upon the effect of Airbnb and short-term rental services on affordable housing, the current legal framework, but also we would like to brainstorm about the possible solution under the Digital Services Act. The e-commerce directive was an important milestone in the internet regulation. It laid down important principles such as the country of origin principle, the no general monitoring obligation, and liability rules. We'd like to discuss the ways we can give authorities the tools to tackle the problems for housing, while also making sure that we don't oblige providers to monitor private content or use filters on their platform, and that we don't prevent development of new services or community projects in Europe. I would love to hear the views on possible data sharing obligation in line with GDPR, authorization scheme, ways to improve cooperation between platforms and authorities, and ways to define lists of non-compliant house renting services. Our first speaker was Zdeněk Hřib, the mayor of Prague, and now I will give the floor to our second speaker. That is Murray Cox, founder of Inside Airbnb, which is an independent non-commercial website showing data and visualization that allows to explore how Airbnb is really being used in cities around the world, and the data is published in a public domain. Do we have our speaker online? Okay. I am getting the information that our second speaker is not online yet, so we'll proceed with our next speaker, Andrej Savin, director of CBS Law, whose main work is on information technology law and the e-commerce directive. Andrej, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think my task is to give an overview in the few minutes I have of what the EU law actually does in this area. And this is a somewhat convoluted issue because there's been some cases that seem to be contradictory, and there's been repeated calls to take this to the EU level in the Digital Services Act and so on. So let me begin by this. I mean, you may have heard about the Airbnb case, the European Court of Justice case. And in that case, it was decided that Airbnb is essentially an information society service. And because it's an information society service, it can't be regulated like an accommodation service, but it has to be regulated under the more liberal regime, under the e-commerce directive. And then all of a sudden, a little bit after that, the Kali apartment case shows up and says something apparently completely different. It says, oh, well, you know, if you have a public policy issue, such as the one that the Paris municipality had, then it is okay, and you can indeed impose public policy restrictions on the accommodation providers or accommodation unit offers. Now, these cases are not actually contradictory. These cases are two completely different things. The Airbnb case is essentially about information society services. The Kali Apartments case is about the services directive. So they're not saying something different. They're simply giving two different perspectives on one and the same issue. So what we now know is that as of after the Kali Apartments case, Airbnb is an information society service provider subject to the Information Society Directive and not to municipal laws. The reasons for that are relatively clear, but we do not have time to go into that. They're not contradictory to earlier European case law. But the interesting thing is that what Kali is essentially saying is Kali is targeting not Airbnb, but Kali is targeting providers. And this is where the problem actually lies. We can regulate either at municipal level or at European level apartment providers. But what we cannot do, we cannot get these platforms to cooperate with that regulation. And this is where the question of what the role of the Digital Services Act is. Where does the Digital Services Act come? And what is actually interesting is if you look at what happened in Amsterdam in 2014, and those who are more familiar with the Dutch legislation will correct me, Airbnb was very eager to cooperate with the city. And they signed a memorandum of understanding. And in that memorandum of understanding, they have looked at issues such as active enforcement, preventive enforcement, and applying municipal taxes. And for a long time, they were saying, oh, we cannot really help with active enforcement. We can't keep track of all these things. We can't collect the taxes for you. But it was so important for them that Amsterdam actually signs up. And Amsterdam was one of the first that had legislation on house sharing, that they actually cooperated. And we had this memorandum. I don't know what has happened since, how effective this tax collection had been. But they have actually been playing along, so to speak. The interesting thing now becomes, we have the Digital Services Act, and there are increasing calls to make the platforms cooperate with that side of enforcement. It is about the owners of units, renters of units, landlords, and so on. So it's not so much that we're interested in targeting platforms and making platforms do something that they would normally want to do, but it is about getting the platforms to cooperate in enforcement in a situation where they actually reap huge profits and run their whole business model. And the question is, what does Digital Services Act do here? Well, I don't know, because I haven't seen the act. It is coming along, and it's coming actually in two packages: in Digital Service Act and Digital Market Act. The Digital Service Act will contain the Digital Service Act will be rewriting of the e-commerce directive, and that's the bit that's interesting for us. The Digital Market Act will have something called ex ante application of competition rules, which is something that we've only seen in competition law. So this is something entirely new, and this is for gatekeeping platforms. I doubt that that bit can be used on Airbnb, because it would require you assigning Airbnb the status of somebody who is a dominant market player, abusing its dominant position and so on, and then imposing remedies. Instead of this, I think what we can do, what many of you have already said, impose within the Digital Services Act, which is horizontal, that is, it applies to all services, a sector-specific legislation, a specific piece of legislation, specific provision targeting only platforms such as Airbnb, saying you have to cooperate, you have to collect municipal tax, you have to give all information, and you have to basically do all those things that we do in order to enforce. So that is a short overview of what's happening.
Thank you very much, Andre. So in the meantime, the technical difficulties have been resolved. So we can welcome our final speaker in this panel, Murray Cox, founder of Inside Airbnb. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for letting me be part of this important conversation. My name is Murray Cox. I'm the founder of Inside Airbnb, which is a data activist project started in 2015. And the project was initially started because there wasn't any data available on Airbnb or short-term rental platforms. That was one of the biggest demands by cities. And so I feel that need, and now I provide open data on more than 100 different cities. But more than that, because of my data project, I've connected with cities around the world, activists around the world, and I've become an expert of how cities are reacting, the regulations that they use, and also how the platforms respond to those regulations. In fact, I've done some studies last year for the city of Barcelona, the Open University of Catalonia, and the Sharing Cities Action Task Force, where we approached 70 different cities in that task force, and we asked them about their regulations. It's very clear that most cities are adopting 3 strategies to regulate short-term rental platforms, and these need to be supported by the Digital Services Act. First, a demand for data. Secondly, registration and permit systems, sometimes mandatory. And then also platform accountability. In terms of demanding data, this can be used for policy creation, even before regulations are being considered, to understand what the impact is. The data cannot be aggregated. It can't be aggregated to the citywide. It needs to be down to the neighborhood level at least. And in the case of enforcement, data needs to include addresses. For the registration systems, this is one of the strategies that most cities are using. In the case of a permit, there's usually proof of residency, yearly caps. And the last component of registration is platform accountability. So ensuring that platforms only display listings that have permit numbers decided by the cities, including a process for taking down listings. And so this really gets around the argument that you're asking platforms to police content on their platforms. It's really a simple system with a registration number. The city takes care of determining whether the listings are legal or not. And In fact, Airbnb itself has introduced recently the city portal, which isn't useful unless you have regulations. It will only be useful if there are regulations that allow data to be provided by the portal or take down notices. So there are some economies of scale being introduced by necessity because of the fact that multiple cities are using these regulatory systems. Just a quick word about self-regulation. I think it's failed. The memorandum of understandings, for example, in Barcelona, Barcelona was only able to achieve that because of the high visibility of the issue in Barcelona. Cities around the world don't have that capability to create the public debate, and so it's quite difficult to expect every city to negotiate with a platform. In the case of Amsterdam, the platform Airbnb agreed to the 60-day limit, but as soon as Amsterdam reduced it to a 30-day limit, Airbnb refused to police that limit. In the case of Paris, Paris had a 120-day cap. Airbnb offered to adhere to that cap, but only in certain neighborhoods. So they chose which neighborhoods they were going to follow the laws. When I surveyed more than 20 cities last year, they recommended regulations over negotiations with platforms. So as we think about the Digital Services Act, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm very clear that these regulations are being required. Most cities are proving the impact and then introducing regulations such that I mentioned, so they're required. The Digital Services Act needs to take these examples into account. It cannot be just a pure horizontal regulation. Airbnb is not Facebook, is not Uber. These are clear differences that need to be accounted for, and we need to think about that when we're advocating for a strong Digital Services Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that concludes our speakers list, and I would like to thank to all our speakers in the second panel. What have we heard? We have heard the case of Prague as one of the examples. The difficulties they face with short-term rentals, and also some ideas. What information and what mechanisms could cities use in order to ensure the compliance from short-term rental platforms? Also, I would like to thank for the summary of the current legal status and the possibility of cooperation via either a memorandum like in Amsterdam or obligation to provide information and cooperation. Also, we have heard on the data showing the impact of Airbnb and strategies used by cities in on data sharing, on registration, on platform cooperation, which leads us to the questions and answers. So let me see whether we have received any questions so that I can ask them on your behalf towards our panelists. Okay, so we have a question for Dorit. Please, do I understand it correctly that the key issue to solve in order to better regulate the market is the lack of data from the platforms? Do you think that mandatory data sharing would solve the problem? Would it subsequently solve also enforcement issue by having the data as proof? I hope that we have all our panelists online also from the first panel so that we can do a joint Q&A. Unfortunately, we don't have Dorit, but we have other panelists, so maybe someone else can take it. Murray, do you want to take the question?
Sure. So I think that if a city receives only data and that's the only requirement that they are able to get from the platforms, I don't think that is enough. For example, what would be the process for getting a platform to take down a listing that was illegal? I think that the platform accountability component is essential. New York City recently just passed some bills that allowed them to receive data from platforms. But my understanding from talking to the city is that it will be a nightmare in terms of going through the data. Also, I spoke to the city of Barcelona recently. When they have a memorandum of understanding where they do receive data from Airbnb, from their experience, 60 to 70% of the listings have incorrect addresses, and that this could be because the hosts know that the data is being provided to the city, or it could be for some other reason, but data is not the salvation.
Thank you for your answer. Another question that I will take myself, I'll be really brief, is data reporting specified by law, taxes, building regulation, day caps, etc., is key for digital enforcement. Is there a green position on GDPR and data reporting? And my brief answer to this is, and I already addressed that in my introductory part, that all regulation needs to be in line with the GDPR requirements. We cannot, really breach people's privacy for sake of other regulation. Now, another question. Do you think that mandatory data sharing would solve the problem that I think, partly covered? Would it subsequently solve also enforcement issue by having the data as proof? Does anybody want to maybe elaborate on that? Okay, Clotilde?
Yeah, just to say, in our report, we have an interesting interview with researchers. And what we found out that actually the big issue about data is aggregation of the data. So Eurostat just concluded an agreement in March 2020 with Airbnb and others on sharing data. But the big issue is that it's really broad data that will not be really useful for cities. So we believe that data sharing can actually facilitate implementation if the data shared is very precise. So one of the researchers was suggesting to use a grid of 1 square kilometers, so that if cities, municipalities know in this area we have this number of Airbnb listing, it will be doable for them to track them. Because the problem at the moment is that it's mission impossible for municipalities to track down where are the Airbnb listings. So it's about having very aggregated data.
Thank you very much. And last question, and then we'll run into conclusion, is what is the panelists' point of view on shifting the power of the country of destination principle, at least to some degree, towards the country of destination, where the service is in fact provided, wouldn't it ensure legal certainty for member states, public administrations, and help with all the current issues in the fields of taxes, housing, and so on and so forth? That is a question that we received from the audience. Does anybody want to take that question from the panelists? And I'm probably looking maybe at Murray, yeah?
I'm sure. I mean, I think it's very clear, and cities have argued for this, that the legal jurisdiction should be where the impact is, where the impact of housing. Each city should have the sovereign right to control their destiny, and also the concept that housing is a human right. Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, should not be the jurisdiction. In the case of continental Europe, there's a different legal system between continental Europe and the Republic of Ireland, which is based on the British system. It's entirely inappropriate for that to be the case. I think the country of origin concept, I think, makes more sense from a consumer point of view, but not when you're talking about the public interest and the impacts in the cities where the service is actually taking place.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all our panelists. It was a fruitful discussion. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully our audience enjoyed it as well. And now I will give the floor to Kim for conclusion.
Yes.
Kim, is that correct? Are you now
Yes.
now on the list?
And Sarah together. Hi, there you are. So first of all, I guess we give the floor to Sarah.
Thank you very much. You can hear me? Yeah. So good afternoon. I'm Sarah Koupchou, and on behalf of the Fondation Abbé Pierre that I represent, I would like to thank the Housing Solutions Platform and our partners FEANSA and Housing Europe. I would like also thank Kim van Sparrentak for hosting this webinar with the Greens. And finally, I would like to thank Clotilde Clark-Fourquet for her investment in the production of the report and the organization of this event. So to introduce my remarks, I would like to remind you of the definition of the city. According to the French dictionary, Le Petit Robert, the city is a geographical and social environment formed by a large number of buildings housing inhabitants who work, for the most part, within the urban center. So you can see where I'm going with this, and I had already mentioned 2 years ago on the same subject, the importance of housing in the definition of the city and in its social role. Housing is at the heart of the life of European citizens. It is at the heart of the implementation of social rights. We live where we work. That is what a city is. But that's not all. And today's debate has shown us that housing is also at the heart of the economy. Today, it is an economic safe haven, a financial instrument with an incredible return, a stable investment in this time of crisis. Short-term rentals provide good incomes for hosts, professional or not. Yet, it is time to change the way we look at housing. Housing is a human right. But housing should also be a social investment by member states and the European Union for the future, because the housing crisis has a huge cost. It is clear that platforms are not solely responsible for this crisis, but it contributes to it when the law does not sufficiently regulate them. We heard from almost 10 years that Airbnb is good for the economy, for sure. But the increase in the budget for housing subsidies and emergency accommodation for the 700,000 homeless people in Europe is not good for the economy. The growing share of housing costs in household budget is not good for the economy. The inability of workers to house themselves near their workplace is not good for the economy. Financial arrangements and taxes not paid by platform and by hosts are not good for the economy. And our continent cannot afford this cost anymore. So it is urgent for local, national, and European institutions to put an end to this crisis. And this will include, among other things, of course, the regulation of short-term rental platforms. The Ditigal Services Act is the first opportunity, a first way. It will not be the last one, so that European citizens will have once again the possibility to live in their cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for those interesting remarks, and also again for the hard work you did to make sure that we know more about the extent of the issue and what can we do to solve it. Thank you. Yes, and I would like actually to thank all of you for this very interesting discussion. I think we've heard some very interesting points that we can definitely take along in our work in the European Parliament. It's also very important to hear all the many examples of the impact of online short-term rentals on affordable housing. For example, that the city of Venice now has the same amount of beds available for tourists as residents. It's almost incomprehensible. We also heard about the importance of collecting data on the extent of the problem to further the development of appropriate regulations to protect the quality of life of residents of cities. And besides interesting examples of the impact from Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Prague, and Venice, we also heard good points about possible solutions. We heard data sharing coming back a number of times, and we heard about the data sharing law in Prague. And also we will take away the suggestion of publishing registration numbers. Long story short, it is clear that self-regulation has failed and things have to change. So let's look at the way forward. What can the Ditigal Services Act mean for enforcement of rules against illegal short-term holiday rentals? Large online platforms with such an important impact in the real world should not be able to hide behind EU internet laws. And we really think that the DSA is the opportunity to fix this. To enforce local rules, first, we need more transparency. And we will fight to ensure online platforms share data where strictly necessary for enforcement, of course, in line with the GDPR. Secondly, we need online platforms active on the rental market to require registration numbers, because this would make enforcement a lot easier. And thirdly, we need to improve the notice and action procedures and interfaces between local authorities and the platforms, for example, through a simple online register. I would really like to thank our speakers and panelists, Dorit, Janet, Alice, Clotilde, Virginie, Zdenek, Moray, André, and Sarah for sharing all the insights. And I would really like to thank Ernest and Marcel, my colleagues, for co-organizing this event. And I also want to thank the people at home following this debate. And thank you so much for your participation and the great questions that were being asked by you. As Greens EFA in the European Parliament, we will continue fighting for the fundamental right to housing, and having this input from civil society, cities, activists is really important for our work, and you can count on us to take this with us in the European Parliament. Thank you.